Hello again, my little conscripts, and welcome to another Mordian Glory video. In today's episode, we will be going through the pros and cons of every faction in the tabletop game of Warhammer 40k. I'm going to be delving into the strengths and weaknesses of each faction. So if you're someone who's looking to pick up a new army, or you're a veteran who's trying to get some insights on how to beat a new foe, then hopefully you'll find this video helpful. And so without further ado, let's fix bayonets, hold the line, and charge right into today's episode. Achtung, conscripts! Warlord Games is now an official sponsor of the Mordian Glory channel. And not only that, they have given me an affiliate link which I have popped down in the description below. By using that link, you can get your hands on some awesome World War II bolt action miniatures and at the same time support the Mordian Glory channel. You have all of my ideas, so what are you waiting for? Do the right thing and buy yourself some bolt action today. As is only fitting, let us begin with the poster boys of the entire game, the Space Marines. Space Marines are a semi-elite take-all-comers faction with a lot of tools in their toolbox. Due to them being arguably the main faction of the game, they've got all the different units that you could possibly want. You want to have close combat guys armed with pistols and chainswords, or power swords and thunder hammers, you got it. You want to have long-ranged infantry armed with devastating anti-tank weapons, you've got it. You want to have lumbering walkers that can either punch holes through walls or blast apart enemy monsters, you've got it. And if you want lumbering battle tanks armed to the gills with some of the best weapons that the Imperium has, well, you guessed it, you got it. From a gameplay point of view, the biggest advantage of the Space Marines, their greatest strength, is they have an answer for everything. They're always going to have a tool that they can apply to a situation, and they can do a little bit of everything. If you want to run a more combat-focused army, you can do. If you want to run a more shooty army, you can do. And if you want to have a nice balanced blade, which can do a bit of everything, then this is absolutely doable and often eminently encouraged when collecting this faction. And from a collecting point of view, Space Marines are a hobbyist wet dream, because there's always a new kit that's being released and you have one of the largest ranges of models available. So there's always something for you to get excited about and something for you to pick up and some excuse for you to have to expand your army. However, it's not all sunshine and lollipops, and Marines do have a few big disadvantages. Like I said, they're semi-elite, so whilst you might not need as many models for them as other factions, there are going to be different armies out there which are going to out-specialize you. If you're an army of generalists, it means you can handle most situations quite well, but you can't handle every situation the best. If you come across Eldar, they're probably going to outmaneuver you. If you come across Tyranids, they're probably going to out-horde you. And if you come across Custodes, they're probably going to out-quality you. Marines are the jack of all trades, but they are the master of none. And furthermore, it's not even other completely different factions which are out-competing Space Marines. There are actually other kinds of Space Marines which do their job better. One of the things that the faction is suffering from the most right now in the tabletop game is brain drain. Because why would you collect generic Space Marines when you could collect non-codex compliant, when you can collect some of the more specialized chapters and get all of the tools available to the regular Space Marines and then a whole bunch of extra stuff besides? This leads us on to our second faction in the video, and that is the Black Templars. These are the ultra-zealous Space Crusaders of the Imperium, and they've literally been on what they call the Eternal Crusade since the end of the Horus Heresy. There's a fun little bit of lore in their faction where they found a loophole with the Codex Astartes where you're only allowed to have 1,000 Space Marines in your chapter unless you're on crusade. And so the Black Templars basically immediately went, we're on crusade! We're always on crusade! And as a result, they are one of the largest Space Marine chapters, and no one really knows how many Marines they have in their faction, but considering that most Marine chapters have about 1,000. There are estimates that Black Templars could have as many as 6,000 to 10,000 Marines in the lore. I'm not gonna lie, Black Templars are my favorite kind of Space Marine chapter, and not only does that come down to their pretty grimdark and badass lore, but also their aesthetic, but also their playstyle. Because one of the things that separates Black Templars from regular Space Marines is they get a whole bunch of unique units. The two most iconic ones being the Emperor's Champion and the Crusader Squad. The Emperor's Champion very well may be the coolest character in 40k, both lore and on the tabletop. He is basically the premier duelist of the setting. His job is to seek out any character on the tabletop, seek out the hardest people and challenge them to 1v1 duels, accepting any challenge no matter the odds. And as someone who's been running the Emperor's Champion in my Black Templar armies for 5 or 6 years now, there's nothing cooler than sending your Emperor's Champion up against everything from Orc war bosses to Demon Primarchs. And you know what? Sometimes he comes out the other side of those fights battered and bloodied, yet victorious, and taking down things he really has no right to take on, because he's just that good at killing characters. But the Crusader Squad is what defines the faction. It is a massive blob of Space Marines. Most Space Marine units come in squad sizes of 5, and sometimes it can take as many as 10. Black Templar Crusader squads can have 20 Marines in them, and there is a genuine playstyle that not only looks incredible on the tabletop, but also is a ton of fun to play and could be damn effective, called the Black Tide. This is where you take over 100 Black Templar Space Marines in their Crusader squads and you just charge across the battlefield. It's one thing gunning down 100 small termagants or 100 orc boys, but there are very few armies that can deal with 100 power armored zealous killing machines just bum rushing them across the table and putting them to the sword. Unfortunately, the Black Tide does have a big weakness, which essentially it is a bit of a stat check. It's overwhelming until suddenly it isn't, and it's very, very powerful until suddenly someone hard counters it. And it's pretty simple to hard counter. Just bring enough guns and have some effective screening. But if you're the kind of person that just loves the idea of having a horde of Marines and them being badass Space Crusaders, the Black Templars are definitely for you. But now let's look at our next Divergent Space Marines, our next specialist chapter, and that is the Blood Angels. From a lore perspective, I think the best thing about the Blood Angels is they had the best Primarch. I'm just going to say it, he was the coolest. Sanguinius is goated, and you can't even dispute it. It's not an opinion, it's a scientific fact. On the tabletop and from a collecting point of view, one of the best bits about Blood Angels is not only their quite unique aesthetic, but also the fact they have a lot of unique units to call upon. You've got epic heroes like Astorath and Lamatis, but then you've also got things like the Death Company and the Sanguinary Guard. You've got your own special kind of dreadnoughts as well, and a load of other stuff. On the surface, it might seem like Blood Angels and Black Templars play in a very similar way. Both are melee-orientated chapters. The big difference is, whereas Black Templars tend to deploy en masse and just bum rush you down and have lots of bodies, knowing they're going to take some casualties along the way, Blood Angels tend to be a lot faster, focusing on jetpacks and highly maneuverable troops. A favoured tactic of the Blood Angels is something called staging, where you take your jetpack troops and you boost them up the board at the beginning of the game, but you hide them behind line of sight blocking terrain. This means that the enemy can't see them, but if the enemy gets too close to try and get angles on the unit behind the ruin, then any Marines they don't kill are going to be in a perfect position to jump out and countercharge. And considering how ferocious Blood Angels are in combat, you only need a handful of them to be alive for them to cause some real carnage. And let me tell you, this isn't just theory crafting. This is based on hard-won experience. I can't tell you the number of times that I thought I had a Blood Angels unit down and out, only for 2 or 3 Death Company or Sanguinary Guard or a lone character to come barreling out of a ruin and just slaughter an entire squad of my guardsmen. But I would say the big disadvantage of Blood Angels is their durability. They do have some tough units like Sanguinary Guard, but they don't really have the numbers of the Black Templars, and the majority of their guys are wearing the same power armor as every other Space Marine. And so if they don't kill what they attack, what it often means is they're left out in the open, exposed, and then they can get blown off the table. Blood Angels need to constantly be moving forward, carrying the day, and having the momentum in the game. If they start getting bogged down or forced onto the defensive, it can mean that they start struggling in the game. So if you like an elite, fast-moving combat army that's got some incredible models and good lore, then the Blood Angels are for you. Another divergent and specialist Space Marine chapter are the Dark Angels. Dark Angels are more shadowy and secretive. If you like some sneaky Marines that maybe have got some more grimdark or morally grey lore, then these guys are for you. The Black Templars and the Blood Angels are not good guys. They definitely have their flaws, but they're often seen as more direct go-getting kind of chapters, whereas the Dark Angels tend to be a little bit more clandestine. One of the best things about Dark Angels is they have some really well established and distinctive playstyles. Now don't get me wrong, all Marine chapters can pretty much do a little bit of everything, but Dark Angels specialize even further by having dedicated Deathwing, Ravenwing and Greenwing playstyles. Greenwing refers to the green armor of the Dark Angels, and it's basically their hybrid playstyle, taking a little bit of everything. Deathwing and Ravenwing are much more specialist. The Deathwing is an entire army of Terminators, and yes, that is as cool and badass as it sounds. While some people might disagree, I personally believe that the Dark Angels are the premier Terminator faction of the entire setting. They get not only the same Terminators as everyone else, but they get a whole bunch of extra cool Terminator units that only they can use, like Deathwing Knights, which very well may be the dead hardest infantry in the game. And on the other end of the spectrum, if you like a bit more speed with your violence, you've got the Ravenwing. This is the motorized cavalry detachment of the Dark Angels. Basically, all the Marines ride around on motorbikes with like melter guns and power armored pickaxes, and then they've got all sorts of land speeders and unique flyers that they can call upon as well. On the tabletop right now, Dark Angels very well may be the most powerful of the chapters. And that is because not only do they get all of the Space Marine stuff, but unlike the Blood Angels and the Black Templars, who kind of have like one or two unique playstyles that they can lean into, Dark Angels can take all of the advantages of hybrid Space Marines and then combine them and catalyze them with their own very good specialist tools like the aforementioned Deathwing Knights, making for a Space Marine playstyle that truly has very few disadvantages. Honestly, if you're looking for the best take-all-comer Space Marine chapter, and one that long-term always seems to get treated good by Games Workshop, I'd go for the Dark Angels every time. But the last unique Space Marine chapter and Codex Divergent Force that you can collect are the Space Wolves. Space Wolves are basically Vikings in space. You'll see lots of references to runes. They've got rune priests, rune axes, rune weapons, all this kind of stuff. And of course, you've got the sort of shaggy barbarian vibe with all of the wolf pelts and general fur adorning their uniforms. Like the Black Templars and the Blood Angels, Space Wolves are generally seen as a melee chapter. But what really differentiates them from everyone else, including the Dark Angels, is just how many extra units they get. This is all based on the lore of the Space Wolves, but essentially they're not really a chapter. They're a legion in all but name. And because of this, the Space Wolves have a very unique structure. Rather than tactical Marines and Intercessors, they've got Grey Hunters. Rather than Neophytes, they have got Blood Claws. And so because of this very unique structure, essentially you can build a Space Wolf army using all unique units and never having to lean into some of the regular Space Marine units. Basically, unlike the other specialist chapters, which essentially take a normal Marine list and then season it with a few of their own unique units, Space Wolves can truly build a standalone army using only their unique options. The advantage of this is Space Wolves are not just another power armored faction, and they do feel quite different to play with and against on the tabletop. The disadvantage is that a lot of this distinctive stuff is Firstborn based. And with GW saying they want to phase out Firstborn and make everything Primaris, there's a little bit of an uncertainty hanging over things like the Blood Claws, the Grey Hunters, and the Longfangs. Will they go away, or will GW remaster them in Primaris? We just don't know yet. Oh, and one other thing, apparently everyone who collects Space Wolves is a furry, so you're going to have to deal with those kind of jokes if you collect the faction. Now that just about covers the Space Marines and their divergent chapters, but there is another kind of Marine faction that we need to cover, and that is the Grey Knights. To the uninitiated, Grey Knights may just look like Silver Space Marines, but nothing could be further from the truth. Whereas your average Marine is going to have a bolter or bolt rifle and be clad in a set of armor, giving him a 3+ save, just some power armor, Grey Knights all come with storm bolters, giving them double the number of shots, power weapons, meaning they can take on pretty much anything in close combat, and they all have a 2+ save. Even the ones that look like they're wearing power armor actually get a 2+ save. Oh yeah, and they can all teleport pretty much all of the time. They get all of the best gear, and on top of this, every single one of them is a Psyker. And that's because Grey Knights are the demon hunters of the Imperium. Whenever chaos starts rearing its ugly head and trying to tickle you with its naughty tentacles, the Grey Knights are sent in to clean up the job, and they are damn effective at this. But don't get it twisted. They are just as handy going into other factions as well, because it turns out having an entire army of Doomslayers and equipping them so they can literally take on the hordes of hell means they can also deal with some Orks and Tyranids at the same time. Grey Knights are really cool. They've got a whole roster of their own units that they don't really share with anyone else, and they've got an easy color scheme, so they're great for beginners to get on. Literally, rattle can of Ironbreaker, Norn Oil, you're about 90% of the way there, and it'll look pretty good as well. The big problem with the Grey Knights right now is their lore and how you feel like they should play doesn't really line up with how they actually play on the tabletop. They should be going around slicing and dicing every mother in the room. What Grey Knights actually do at the moment on tabletop is hide, teleport around, and score points. They've got a bit of a bad rap at the moment in 10th edition because their damage output is pretty low, but their maneuverability is very, very high. So what this tends to mean is they avoid fights and then just go around picking up what primary and secondary points they can do without ever really engaging with you. And when they do engage with you, it often feels like they're just absolutely dogpiling and bullying one side of the board before teleporting away to the other side of the board. Some people really like that playstyle. It's kind of like trying to catch smoke with your hand, trying to like fight a ghost. But it can be a little frustrating to play against. And historically, Grey Knights have always either been completely on or completely off the tabletop. There's a bit of a meme where for 3 months of every edition, Grey Knights are the most broken, overpowered faction. They always get their 3 months in the sun. A lot of people have them as a secondary faction, a secondary army for this reason. They'll have a main army which they play with most of the time, and then when the Grey Knights are in the ascendancy, they'll just crush everyone with them for 3 months, and then when they get nerfed again, they'll put them back on the shelf. So they're a very cool army with great lore, but their fortunes really do wax and wane. Moving on from all the different flavors of Space Marine, we now have got some of the other armies of the Imperium, and let's begin with some Sisters of Battle. The Adeptus Sororitas are the female badass warriors of the Imperium. They are the most fanatical and the most loyal of all of their armed forces, and, well, they just love burning things. I'm serious, I'm not kidding. This is a key part of their lore and their playstyle on the tabletop. They have something called the Holy Trinity, except for this isn't the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. It's genuinely the bolter, the melter, and the flamer. By all of those things, the enemies of the Imperium will be purged. Now, sisters don't get a lot in the way of heavy armor. Arguably, their heaviest tank is the Castigator, which is essentially a Space Marine Predator that someone put a lot of candles on. But what they do get is some very capable core infantry, which is then supplemented by the most mind-bogglingly weird and wonderful units. Alongside your regular Sisters of Battle, in their power armor and with their bolters, you're going to have things like Arcoflagellants. Arcoflagellants are men who have committed the worst crimes in the Imperium. And in between battles, they're basically put in a state of calm. They have these masks welded onto their faces. And these masks just show them calm, pleasant imagery. Essentially like just reruns of Bob Ross over and over again. But when they get into battle, suddenly they're not shown calm stuff anymore. Suddenly they are shown their worst crimes. All of the murders and all of the other mad stuff that they or others have done. And they are programmed to go into a berserker frenzy, and they are pumped full of combat drugs and just launched at the enemy as living weapons. Oh yeah, and all of their arms have been amputated at the elbow and replaced with electro flails. In my mind, the biggest advantage of the Sisters are these oddball units, because they can be quite tricky to deal with on the battlefield, and they often punch well above their weight. Also, Sisters units tend to be really competitively costed points-wise. For example, a Sister battle will cost you 10 points, but a Space Marine might cost you 18 or 20 points. But there's a reason why they're cheaper. And one of their disadvantages is they tend to be much more fragile. You might think that a person in power armor is a person in power armor, but it's not. Sisters have less toughness, Sisters have got less wounds. This is because essentially they are unaugmented humans that get to wear power armor, whereas Space Marines are super soldiers that have been genetically engineered, which gives them a few extra advantages. So if you want an army that is going to have some really, really kooky, but just amazingly inventive and awesome units, go for Sisters. But be aware that you might struggle to get into some direct firefights with the enemy, because your durability isn't quite that of other armies. But if you want durability, if you want to be the tank of the game, then look no further than the Adeptus Custodes, the golden warriors of the Imperium. Custodes are not just golden marines. Custodes are better than Marines. Custodes are better than you, and they're going to let you know it. Custodes are the best army, model for model, in the game. And in the lore. In the lore, there is nothing that can take a Custodes on one by one. The only time they ever die is when essentially they get nuked from orbit, or they're overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of lesser foes. On the tabletop, a basic Custodian Guard can go toe-to-toe with the main combat characters of other factions. You can have Chaos Lords get into a one-on-one fight with the Custodian Guard, and there's a real chance that the main hero of the opposing army loses that fight. They are even better armed and equipped than the Grey Knights, and this is because they are the Emperor's bodyguards. They are the people protecting the Golden Throne. They are the people on Terra making sure that the Emperor is never disturbed and never destroyed. Of course, this insane level of power does need to be balanced out. And so on the tabletop, this means that they are the elite army. They are more elite than Grey Knights. They are more elite than Dark Angels, Deathwing. They are the elite force. You only need a handful of models to be a Custodes player. Like seriously, buy 3 start collectings, you'll probably have a full 2,000 point Custodes army. This comes with, of course, some advantages. It means they're very easy to build and paint up to a full strength army, making them a cheaper army to collect. And their paint scheme is really simple. You can buy a spray can called Retributor Armor. Buy that, spray your models, wash them in Norn oil, do the ponytails in red and do the blades in blue and finger scoop some astro granite on the bases of the models, and you've got a battle ready Custodes army. You could paint an entire army of them in a weekend or in a very dedicated afternoon and just get playing. The disadvantage of Custodes is twofold. Firstly, if you do lose an entire squad of them in one go, maybe you just roll badly on your 2-up saves or your 4-up invulnerables, then it can be a pretty big blow. The other disadvantage of them, though, is they can be kind of grindy to play into, and some people, and being honest, including me, can find them a little frustrating, because you can sometimes roll buckets and buckets of dice, 50 cal, rockets, and it just doesn't do a thing. And so, whilst it can feel like a complete power trip to play with the Custodes, some people do find them somewhat unenjoyable to play into. But that's enough talking about elite armies. Let's get into something with a little bit more quantity. Let's take a look at the Adeptus Mechanicus. Whilst not strictly a true horde army, you can get a lot of AdMech on the table, and they certainly feel a lot less elite than something like Space Marines or Custodes. Like Sisters of Battle, they tend to have a lot of wonderful and wacky units, but it's a very different aesthetic. AdMech is all about that technology. It's all about the diesel punk. So you're going to find lots of crazy robot stuff going on, and pretty much everything is going to be covered in cybernetics and augmetics. For example, their basic infantry is called the Scutari. This is where you take a human and you chop the legs off and put robot legs on so he can run faster. You lobotomize him and put a giant radio antenna in his brain. So you don't issue him orders verbally, you just essentially download them, email them directly into his brain, and rather than training the soldiers, you just give them a software update. Oh yeah, and then you chop his arms off and give him robot arms, probably because the tech priest just thought it was funny. From a lore perspective, the AdMech can be argued to be the true bad guys of the Imperium, and everyone in the Imperium is pretty awful. They have absolutely no ethics, absolutely no moral compass, and they will just do experiments on anyone they can get their hands on just because they think they might have a good idea. On the tabletop, their playstyle is both similar and also the complete opposite to Sisters of Battle. They have a lot of very wacky units, but they tend to be more long-ranged, whereas Sisters of Battle have a lot of wacky units, yet they tend to be very close-range. Sisters are going to get into your face. They might not necessarily get into melee, but they're going to get in point-blank range and shoot you with a melter gun. AdMech are perfectly happy to disassemble you on the molecular level from halfway across the board. The main disadvantages of this faction aren't even on the tabletop. They're actually a perfectly powerful army. The problem is actually real-life logistics. Firstly, they have some of the most highly detailed models. And considering that they are kind of like a semi-horde army, this can mean it can take a lot of time and a lot of effort to even get a couple of squads together. And you're going to need quite a lot of units. They're very, very labor intensive if you want to paint them up and to make them look good. And on top of this, because of all the detail and options that you get in the kits, they are a really expensive army. If you buy stuff new in box from Games Workshop, I think AdMech might very well be the most expensive army that you can collect in Warhammer. Frankly, they're just too damn labor intensive and too damn expensive, and as a result, you rarely see them on the tabletop. I've been to a lot of tournaments this year, and I think I've seen AdMech precisely once in almost 15 months of competitive play of 40k. And that's a real shame, because I think that they look amazing when you do see them deployed en masse in-game. But they're not the coolest army. The coolest army is his Imperial Guard, the Emperor's true finest, and my personal favorite faction in the entire game. Nay, my personal favorite faction in any setting of all time, whether it's movies, TV shows, tabletop, or video games. The Imperial Guard are, without a doubt, the best faction ever. Now, you might think that is a somewhat biased take, and it is, but it's also one rooted in fact. The Imperial Guard are the poor bloody infantry, the poor bloody humans in the 40k setting. And in a galaxy with genetically engineered super soldiers, literal demons, and planet-devouring alien horrors, strangely, an army which feels the most unique and the most distinctive is just the basic humans. From a hobbying and collecting point of view, the Imperial Guard has got so many good things, so many advantages over other factions. And what might be the biggest one is they are the most relatable army. They're just people like you and me, and they are very flawed, but you can pour your heart and your soul into them and really make them your dudes. If you're ever bored and you just want to kill an hour or two, ask your local guard player what the headcanon is for his guard army. He will happily talk away and just lore dump you with all of this stuff that he's come up with about his army. And it's stuff he has come up with. And then you've got the kit bashing, which is often fed into by all of this homebrew lore and this whole your dudes thing, because guard are one of those armies which you never see just a stock guard army. Every guard player has done something, even just a simple head swap, to make their army unique. For example, with all of my plastic infantry, I've swapped their hats out so that they have got peaked officer hats to represent them as the Mordian Iron Guard, a regiment which is renowned for being so disciplined that they will never do anything without being ordered. Even if they are being completely overwhelmed and surrounded, if the radio guys died and they can't get orders from high command to tell them to retreat, they won't retreat. But it's not just the kit bashing. Guard are one of the few armies and one of the few factions that can rival, if not beat, Space Marines for the number of model kits and options that they have available. We've got 4 different kinds of very, very different basic infantry. And we have got innumerable armored vehicles, from quad-tracked MRAPs all the way up to APCs, IFVs, main battle tanks, super heavy battle tanks. We've got flyers, we've got sharp knives, we've got sticks, we've got electronic ball breakers. And on the tabletop, this makes Guard a very, very enjoyable faction. Because one thing that I often tell people is once you go Guard, you don't go back. Because the Guard can truly emulate any playstyle of any of the other factions. And whilst they may not be able to do it as good as the ultra specialists, they can give it a good go. Do you want a nice mixture of tanks, infantry, and artillery, a hybrid Guard army? You can do that. Do you want a World War I style pure infantry wave backed up by long-range artillery? You can do that. Do you want to have a more modern force, maybe loaded up in mechanized and motorized transports? You can do that. Do you want to feel an actual company of tanks? You can do that. Do you want to have elite drop troops, special forces that will hit hard and hit fast? You've got that. Do you want to go pure close combat? You've got that. Do you want to have elite units which are tough with multiple wounds and not many models, kind of like Custodes style? You've got Bulgans, you've got Ogres, you can do that. Any conceivable playstyle that you can think of in this game, the Guard can do. And this is both really, really good because it means your army is never boring. You can wake up one day and go, you know what, I think I'd like for the next 6 months to try playing pure infantry Guard. You can do that. On the other hand, there is a saying in the Guard community: a Guard army is never finished. Because just as you finish one kind of playstyle, you'll get an idea to do another kind of playstyle, and then it'll just start all over. The cycle will begin again. This means that Guard armies do tend to be quite expensive in the long run because you end up just exploring all of these different avenues. And while some people will see this as an advantage, others will see it as a disadvantage, they are the horde army of the Imperium. They get more models than anybody else. A normal hybrid Guard army is going to have 80 infantry in it. That's often 3 times as many as the Custodians will have, double what the Space Fiends will have. On top of this, a typical guard army is going to have 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 vehicles in it as well. And then you're going to have specialists and you're going to have artillery on top of that. Guard armies tend to be large and varied. And the big thing with guard is you need to apply combined arms tactics. Blood Angels can just focus on being jet troops and jump around and punch people to death. But guard, you can't do that. You need to have multiple layers of combined arms and force multipliers to make things work. A basic example of this is the orders. Guard have a unique game mechanic where essentially you can have officers that can boost the capabilities of the infantry around them. So let's say you've got a platoon commander who tells his men to take aim. This will make them shoot better. Or he'll tell them to fix bayonets. This will make them better in close combat. Or he will make them, or he'll order them to take cover so that they are less likely to die. Just this simple combination of having an officer and a platoon of infantry will make this unit punch well above its weight. But without those officers, guardsmen, unsupported and uncoordinated, will be beaten by pretty much anything out there. So guard requires you to not just put units into your list, but also think about how those units are going to work together to achieve their goals. And one thing that, and this can be quite tricky, and there's actually something that I advise all new guard players. I say you're going to lose your first 10 games. Whether you're a new player to the setting or whether you are coming over from another faction, you're going to lose your first 10 games. After you lose those first 10 games, you'll start winning because you'll get it. It'll click. You'll understand what should support what weapons you should have in each unit, how all of these things come together, how the sum of the parts is greater than the whole, or whatever the saying is. And so you lose your first 10 games, but then you start winning big. Long story short, Guard is a faction which can do anything. And they can often compete with some specialists, although the ultra specialists will always be able to outdo them because they are just humans at the end of the day. They've got an incredibly varied amount of models, and any playstyle you can think of, they can do. But you need a lot of them, and that's going to take you a lot of time, and it is going to probably cost you a lot of money, and you're going to have to put the effort in to learn the faction because they're not as straightforward as other armies. But if you can bring all of that together, you'll find them an incredibly rewarding army that you can happily stick with as your sole faction for the majority of your Warhammer career, if not all of it. Our last Imperial faction, before we move on to some more heretical stuff, is the Imperial Agents. And I'm going to be upfront with you guys. They're more like half a faction. They're not fully fleshed out. The Imperial Agents represents everything else. That doesn't really fit in the other codexes. So you've got things like the Adeptus Arbites, who are essentially the riot police. And whilst it is entirely possible to build a full riot police army with the Imperial Agents book, they have got some significant gaps in their roster. For example, there are no main battle tanks in the Imperial Agents. And whilst it is entirely possible to build some very cool and thematic armies, like a full Arbites riot force or a full Deathwatch army, although to be fair, Deathwatch are the specialist marines, like the alien hunters, which used to be a standalone faction, which kind of got folded into Imperial Agents. So you can build a kind of standalone Deathwatch army, but for most of the stuff, you'll find that it's just got really, really big gaps, and it's just going to lack certain capabilities. Really, agents are just a bit of a catalogue of allies that you can include in your main faction. For example, you could be a guard player that's got plenty of regular infantry, plenty of tanks and artillery, but what you're struggling with is close combat. Take a unit of Deathwatch Marines with heavy thunderhammers and chuck them into your list. That'll give you that marine quality, and that'll really supplement your guard quantity. So the next faction we're going to look at is going to be a 2-for-1. We're going to look at Knights and Chaos Knights. Whilst Imperial Knights and Chaos Knights do, of course, have their own army rules, fundamentally, they are going to have the same advantages and disadvantages. At their core, whether they believe in the Emperor or they believe in the Dark Gods, They are big, stompy robot things, and they are an entire army of super heavies. And even if you take the baby knights like the Helens and the war dogs, you're still taking an entire army of vehicles. The advantage of Imperial and Chaos Knights is that they look very striking on the tabletop. You can see them from a distance and they look damn impressive. Also, from a gameplay point of view, if your opponent doesn't bring enough anti-tank, well, you are probably going to walk all over him. The disadvantage of Knights, though, is they're a bit of a gatekeeper, they're a bit of a stat check, they're a bit of a skew list. If someone does bring enough anti-tank against you, you are going to fold quickly. You tend to find that Knight games can be over in 2 turns, one way or another. Either they have smashed you or you have utterly smashed them. And there's very, very little in between, especially on the competitive scene. This makes for a very all or nothing playstyle. And sometimes that can be seen as quite relaxing. You just chuck your knights down, run at the enemy, and if you manage to beat them up, then great. And if you don't, well, doesn't matter. Game is over quickly. Go to the bar, get a beer, and wait for the next round to begin. But also, it can lead to some kind of feel-badsy moments, kind of some gatekeepery moments. Because if you're a newer player and you end up going into knights, even just on a casual table, it can feel like you can't do anything. You're just going to get absolutely flattened. You just didn't bring enough anti-tank. You didn't realize there were factions like this. And likewise, if you're a new knight player, you might have all of your awesome giant machines of death, and then in 2 turns you pack it up and taking your models home because you ended up playing into a guard player who absolutely does have the firepower to blow you off the table. Long story short, knight armies tend to be big and imposing and surprisingly easy and affordable to collect, but they also can lead to some quite unsatisfying games if you're not careful. But speaking of chaos, let's get into a really heretical faction, the Chaos Daemons. Demons are the direct puppets, the minions of the Dark Gods. Unlike Chaos Space Marines, who are essentially mortal followers which have been corrupted, demons are the true foot soldiers of the Ruinous Powers. On the tabletop, demons have a number of pretty good advantages. Firstly, because they are part of the warp, every single one of them can teleport in. This gives them some phenomenal maneuverability, and even better, if you take some of the greater demons like Bloodthirsters, it means that the minor demons, the more hoardy options, can actually teleport in really, really close, and that makes it easy for them to get charges off. And considering that for the most part, demons are a melee faction. They want to get into close combat with you. Anything that can let you teleport in and get an easy charge off is a really, really big advantage. Speaking of greater demons and minor demons, you do tend to find that on the whole, demon armies are made of 2 very different kinds of model. You have the really big boys like the Great Unclean One, the Changer of Ways, and the Bloodthirster. And then supporting these knight-sized behemoths, you've then got the minor demons, the scampering hordes of horrors and bloodletters and plague bearers and demonettes. You tend to find that demon armies have the big monsters doing the damage, while the little buggers are doing objectives, doing some screening, doing some chaff work as well. This combination of big stuff and little stuff actually gives them an advantage over other factions such as Imperial Knights, who have the big stuff but don't really have the flexibility and the efficiency that you can get with taking some smaller supporting units. However, demons do have some pretty big disadvantages. Firstly, their shooting is pretty abysmal. If they try and get into a firefight, by and large, they are going to lose that firefight. And they're surprisingly fragile, even on the greater demons. Most of the little guys are going to have a 5-up invulnerable save, and the big guys are going to have a 4th invulnerable save. So if you throw enough stuff at them, you will find that you can whittle them down and bring them down surprisingly easily. In summary, demons have got some very striking and imposing models with a really cool playstyle. They're fast and they're going to be coming out the goddamn walls. But if you can hold the line and keep your finger on the trigger, you'll tend to gun them down in droves. If you want a more tanky and durable Chaos faction, then you may want to consider going for the Death Guard. These are the Marines that are fully embracing and worshipping the Chaos God Nurgle, the god of decay. I do have a little bit of a soft spot for Death Guard. They are the Chaos army that I enjoy playing the most, and I have a pretty large collection of them. Death Guard, they've changed a little bit over the edition. So they used to be the ultimate tanky faction. They've taken a little bit of a step back from that now. They're still fairly durable, but they now do a little bit more than just eat bullets. They can not only take a decent blow, but they can also deal one out. From a distance, you might think that Nurgle is just green Marines and Death Guard are just smelly Marines, but they are very, very different. Not only do they have access to some unique demon engines that no other faction can get access to, such as Plague Burst Crawlers, and you've also got the little Blight Haulers as well, but they have a really powerful mechanic called Contagion, or Gifts of Nurgle. The closer that Nurgle gets to you, the closer that the Death Guard get to you, and the longer that the game goes on, the more that they infect the battlefield. Not only does it allow them to keep holding objectives even if they're not on them, so if a unit of Death Guard walk onto the objective and then they proceed to move on to something else, you get to keep that objective until your enemy goes over there and takes it back for themselves. This is really good for playing primary missions, but also they have a number of debilitating abilities to the enemy or buffs that they can apply to themselves if the enemy is in contagion range. So for example, if you are playing against a shooty army like Guard, then what you can do is pick a contagion ability at the beginning of the game. That means if the enemy is within infection range, in contagion range, they are -1 to their weapon skill and their ballistic skill. This can stack with other things like stratagems like Cloud of Flies or the core stratagem Smoke, meaning that Death Guard armies can make the vast majority of firepower directed at them completely go astray. Or if you want to have a more offensive option, you can pick at the beginning of the game a different ability which degrades the enemy's armor. Essentially the armor like rusts away, and it gives you additional armor penetration on all of your units if the enemy is within contagion range. Long story short, Death Guard are pretty durable. They've got a good amount of damage output. They're definitely a bit of a take-all-comers army, but they also have got some of their own cool units, and if they get close to you and if the game goes on a long time, then you're going to find them powering up more and more and more. Another traitor legion is the Thousand Suns. These are the worshippers of Tzeentch, the Changers of Ways, and they specialize in psychic powers and magic. Thousand Suns and Grey Knights are often compared against each other, but honestly, Thousand Suns are very different to Grey Knights. Firstly, they don't have the army-wide 2-up save, although they do have access to Scarab Occult Terminators, which look really badass. But the main thing is that whilst Grey Knight units have got their own sort of individual psychic powers and abilities, Thousand Suns tend to focus on something called Cabal points. Like with Death Guard and their contagion thing, this is their unique army mechanic. Basically, the more wizards, the more magicians that you have in your army, the more Cabal points you can generate. And these Cabal points can be spent every single turn on some very, very powerful abilities. You can essentially blank enemy damage, or you can have your Thousand Suns put out mortal wounds, essentially firing magic spells at people. Managing your Cabal points effectively is the key to Thousand Suns being powerful on the tabletop, and I assure you they are a very, very powerful army right now. However, if the enemy goes after your sorcerers, then you will start losing Cabal points. You'll have less of them as the game goes on. And this can mean that as your army takes casualties, your power and your ability to leverage your main mechanic can be compromised. But if you want a Chaos Legion that is unbelievably straightforward to pilot and is arguably the best or the quintessential melee faction of the entire game, look no further than the World Eaters. Everything these guys do is about close combat. From their berserkers being battle line infantry, having more attacks than I think anyone else's battle line infantry, and their 8-bound being demon-fused marines that are just unstoppable killing machines, and also pretty damn tough because they get an invulnerable save because they're possessed by demons. And then you've got characters like Khan the Betrayer and Angron. It's all about speed, violence, and momentum with these guys. And generally speaking, if you get into combat with World Eaters, you can be confident that you are going to win that combat. But they are a one-trick pony, and this does come with a couple of disadvantages. Firstly, you have to get into melee range, and on some boards and some terrain layouts, if there's not a lot of cover, you're just going to be charging out across no man's land and getting blasted down, and you don't have any other tools in your toolbox. On the other hand, you've also got the situation where if you do get into combat and someone can counter you, you can't pivot to anything else. A big problem that World Eaters have is dealing with units with the fight first ability. This means that the Khorne Berserkers or the 8-bound charge in, but before they even get to strike, the enemy gets to swing. This can completely take the sting out of their tail. So the advantage of World Eaters is they're badass, they're the combat army, and they're very good at it, but if you can't solve your problems with melee, you're probably going to lose the game. But of course, this covers the specialized traitor Space Marines. What about good old-fashioned Chaos Space Marines, the generic Heretic Astartes? In my humble opinion, I think that the Chaos Space Marine Codex is one of the best written codexes so far in 10th edition, and even across many of the other editions as well. It has something for everyone. Do you want to run an army of truly mortal cultists and semi-possessed humans like a traitor Imperial Guard style force just running out and drowning the enemy in a tide of crazed fanatics? You can do that. Do you want to run an elite siege breaking force with lots of vehicles or lots of demon engines? You can do that. Do you want to have an army that specializes in breaking the enemy's morale? You can do that. Do you want to have a little bit of everything? You can do that. Heretic Astartes have got 8 detachments. That's loads and loads of detachments. That gives them loads of different play styles. You can have armies that are infiltrating, armies that are being sneaky, armies that are being close combat orientated, armies that are being shooting orientated. It would be easy to think that Chaos Space Marines are just evil looking regular Marines, but they have a very, very distinctive playstyle. And they have a very, very different aesthetic, because a lot of the Space Marine stuff now is focused around Primaris, whereas Chaos Space Marines are still an entirely firstborn army. And I think it's going to stay that way as well. A lot of people would draw comparison to Chaos Space Marines to regular Space Marines, but I actually think the faction that they should be compared to is the Imperial Guard. Because like the Guard, if you can think of a playstyle, Chaos Space Marines can accommodate that. You can go pure infantry, you can go elite, you can go horde, you can go quantity, you can go quality, you can go tanks, you can go drop troops, you can do anything with them. And so very much like with Guard, you do find that a lot of Chaos Space Marine players, it's the only faction that they collect. They start with Chaos, and whenever they get a new idea for how they want to run their Chaos army, they can make that a reality on the tabletop. In terms of their advantages and disadvantages on the tabletop, whilst they are fundamentally Marines, and so they are very capable, sometimes they are going to come across more specialist armies that can outdo them in specific areas. For example, you can make a really good Chaos Space Marine Legionnaire squad led by a Chaos Lord, or a Chaos Chosen squad led by a Chaos Lord, and that's going to be a very powerful close combat unit. But you're still not going to be as good at close combat as, let's say, like the World Eaters, for example. You can have a whole bunch of Psykers and Traitor Sorcerers in your Chaos Space Marine army, but you're probably not going to be quite as good as Magic as the Thousand Suns. So they have all of the advantages and disadvantages, which comes with being a little bit more generalist and a little bit less specialist. Although, like I said, you can really lean into certain playstyles. But that just about covers all of the various shades of human, whether they are loyalist or traitor. Now we need to get into the Foul Xenos and the alien factions. First up, we have the enigmatic Eldar. These are essentially space elves. If you like elves and space, you'll like Eldar. They're good at magic, they're very fast, their warriors are very capable, but they tend to be kind of weedy, and they tend to be kind of fragile. What defines the Eldar as a faction, both in lore and on the tabletop, is how specialist individual units are. The whole thing behind Eldar society is they train on like one thing their entire life until they become like the best at that thing. So you'll have like Howling Banshees, which are the premier like shock melee infantry, or the Striking Scorpions, which are the more durable tanky kind of infantry, or you'll have Dire Avengers, which are really good at shooting people, and Dark Reapers, which are good at range, long ranged combat. They've got lots of different specialist units which are very good at that one role. And so the key to making Eldar work on the tabletop is having those specialist units support each other. Because if you take a really melee orientated army, then you might find yourself getting shot off the table. If you take a really shooting kind of army, you might find yourself being chopped off the table. Having all the different parts come together is very, very nice. Also, you're probably one of the fastest armies out there with access to things like jet bikes, which are really, really cool. What I like about Eldar, though, is you can try and have all the different aspects work together, or you could just say, screw that, I'm going to dedicate myself to one playstyle. I am going to have the most jet bikes. I'm going to have the most deep striking stuff. I'm going to have these like fragile sort of grav vehicles flying around with the best firepower. You can really, really commit yourself to a certain playstyle, and you will be able to do that the best almost out of any of the factions. You'll be rewarded for it very much in terms of the feel and the vibe of the army you're trying to create. But you're also going to have some massive gaping holes, and you are going to have some disadvantages. The big disadvantage of the faction, though, more than anything else, is just how elite they tend to be. You do not get much in an Eldar army. You are always going to be outnumbered, even by armies like Marines. And considering that Marines are going to have more wounds than your infantry, can be tougher than your infantry, that can be a real uphill battle. Whenever I play my guard into Eldar, I tend to find that if I just go for a war of attrition, they just can't last past turn 3. And even if I'm being kind of bold and brash, and maybe even a little reckless, I can soak up casualties, whereas they can barely afford them. In summary, from a Xenos perspective, Eldar are probably going to win a lot of one-on-one fights, or bring a lot of elements together to absolutely dominate and localize areas of the battlefield. But if they get into a protracted battle, or if they don't absolutely smash what's in front of them, the clapback is going to hurt them. But if there is one faction that is even more fragile than the Eldar, that is the ultimate in glass hammers in this tabletop game, it has to be the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, these guys are the fastest army in the game. Like, the minimum their vehicles are going to be moving is like 16, 18 inches. The fastest guard vehicle I've got goes 12 inches, and most of them go 10. They are always going to be getting where they want to get to. They're probably always going to hit you first, and they can deliver a hell of a punch behind it. They've got poison weapons, they've got dark light, they've got just a lot of big boom boom and a lot of choppy choppy. So they are speed, they are violence, and they need the momentum. And they also tend to be a little bit more numerous than their Eldar cousins. The disadvantage of Dark Eldar is that they are so fragile. Like, I'm talking lasguns can wound one of their transports called the Venom on like 5s. Like, it's like toughness 5. It's insane. They have literally zero durability outside of a handful of units like the Talos. If they don't kill stuff, if they don't basically wipe stuff out, that any sort of smattering of return fire is just going to put them down. Like, I'm not even kidding you. I was running a game where I had my mech guard, and normally the heavy stubbers that you get free on all your guard vehicles, they don't do anything. My heavy stubbers were racking up so many extra casualties, it was insane. Like, their firepower actually meant something for once. So the thing with Dark Eldar is, do you want to be the fastest guy in the room? Do you want to be like Fry after he took 100 cups of coffee? Then they're the guys for you. They are all gas, no brakes. But if you bounce, if you have a cold turn, if the enemy is able to take your power on the chin, then it is going to go sideways for you very quickly. And when you lose that momentum, you're going to find it hard to recover it. And whilst we're on the topic of quite fragile glass hammery factions, we have got the GSC, the Genestealer Cults. GSC is an army of human and Tyranid hybrids, and you don't want to know how that comes about. They're definitely more of a melee focused faction, with the majority of their damage being done in combat, but they do have some half decent fire support and are an army that can actually ally in up to 1,000 points of Imperial Guard stuff to supplement their firepower even further. This allied Imperial Guard is known as Brood Brothers, and it's a special detachment inside their codex, and it essentially represents the human forces that have been corrupted or infiltrated by the GSC, because their whole thing is they're really, really sneaky, and they're all about like ambushing and coming out the walls, the goddamn walls, and they're all about keeping you off balance. Most Genestealer Cult units have got access to deep strike, and they've got access to a lot of different like shenanigans. If you destroy one of their units, they can roll a dice, and on either a 4+ or a 5+, depending on what else is going on in the game, they can actually bring that unit back via the cult ambush mechanic. They can place these cool like little blip tokens down on the board where their units can then sort of respawn from. It's a very cool army. It's a very grim dark army. It's a very tragic army because typically they overthrow the planet, getting it ready for the Tyranids to turn up, who they mistakenly believe are the star gods, and then the Tyranids turn up and eat them all. So, but with GSC, if you lose the game, you lose. If you win the game, in the long run, lore-wise, narrative-wise, you've probably also lost. But this combination of Tyranids, because they do get Genestealers in their army, and then the hybrids and the mutants, and then the guard stuff, makes for a really, really cool aesthetic. And you get a whole smorgasbord. You get a lot of variety. And what I tend to find with Genestealer armies is they are passion projects. Not a lot of people have them as a main faction, but a huge amount of people have them as a 3rd or 4th army. And that's how I got into mine. I built my entire GSC army based around the Brotherhood of Nord from Command & Conquer. And I went to the effort of putting little scorpions, little scorpion tail freehands on all the shoulder pads. And I really, really went full passion project on it. But the reason why people don't have them as a main army is because they do have a couple of big flaws. Firstly, they are quite a hoardy army. You're going to need a lot of them, so that is a big time investment to get them all painted up. Secondly, they're quite an expensive army. Like, you might need 30 or 40 acolytes in your collection, and they come in boxes of 5 for like 30 or more pounds each, so they can be quite expensive. And then lastly, their fortunes have really waxed and waned over the last few editions. When they were first released in 8th edition, I think that was when they were at their best. They were really peaking. It often felt like this overwhelming tide of fragile, like glass hammer guys were coming at you. But if you could survive the first few turns, then the swarm would peter out. If you could survive the ambush, essentially. But then over 9th and then especially 10th edition, they just don't feel right anymore. That core ambush mechanic might sound great. Oh, I might get my guys back. But you pay for that. For example, a neophyte hybrid has essentially the same stat line as a guardsman. Probably a little bit worse in terms of like the equipment that he can get. But you pay 8 points versus paying like 5.5 points for a Catachan. The reason you pay more is because it's assumed that that unit might come back. You can't just get units back all the time for free. You've got to take that into account. But what if he doesn't come back? You've just paid for a unit as if they would come back, but they haven't. I think the cut ambush mechanic needs to be fundamentally just rewritten, completely torn up and started again. If you want me to have guys coming back, if you want me to have endless hordes of dudes rising up, then make them cheap and I will choose to put more of them in my list. Don't force me to pay for models which may not get their ability off at all. And sadly, because of how wacky this mechanic is, it can make GSC a little bit of a frustrating army to play with, because if all goes well and you keep rolling those 5+, you might get a whole bunch of units back. But if you don't get even 1 or 2 of those units off, you're just going to get rolled every single time. And sadly, the win rate of the GSC right now is completely in the toilet. So when it comes to collecting this faction, they are one of the most unique, one of the coolest, one of the most bespoke armies. You can really pour a lot of character into them. They are a hobbyist and a collector's dream. But from a playing point of view, I'd sit on them for a little bit. But on a more cheerful note, do you like dwarves? Do you like space? Do you like space dwarves? Well then, the Leagues of Votann are for you. They're pretty much exactly what you'd expect. Take your standard sort of Lord of the Rings dwarf or Warhammer Fantasy dwarf sort of faction and Rock and Stone, Deep Rock Galactic, and have them as a faction in 40k. They tend to be quite slow, although I have been told they're great sprinters over short distances, and they tend to have a lot of short-range weapons that are really good up close and personal, and they're pretty damn durable. They're one of the few factions that aren't Space Marines, which essentially get a Space Marine equivalent. And they also get lots of really wacky and distinctive technology. It's kind of like a combination of Space Marines and Adeptus Mechanicus, and then throw in some good old Dwarven and Rock and Stone memes. I also think that Games Workshop has knocked it out of the park with the aesthetic of the faction, especially with the look of things like the Sagittar and the Hecaton Land Fortress, which have got that big sort of moon buggy kind of vibe. On the tabletop, Votann are perfectly powerful. Week in, week out, we get the tournament data, and the little buggers just do all right. Sometimes they're smashing it, sometimes they're having a bit of an off week, but generally they're a solid faction with lots of capabilities and some genuinely powerful and competitive playstyles. The problem is that they only have half a model range. 2 years ago, the faction came out, and they've basically had no new models. They've got about half a dozen data sheets and half a dozen model kits. And really, what the faction is crying out for is an addition to their range, a range expansion. So they're an army you can absolutely get into from a gameplay point of view, but if you like hobbying and stuff, you might find the number of kits available to you quite limiting. Then we have the Necrons, which is essentially ancient Egypt in space, except they have the best technology bar none. The Tau think they've got good technology. The Eldar think they've got good technology. They look like monkeys bashing rocks together in comparison to the Necrons. They are a machine race. Although they weren't always that way. They essentially transcended from fleshy bodies into machine bodies. They have some really good lore as well. When they were first introduced, they were essentially seen as mindless killing machines, and no one really understood them. But over the years, GW has added more and more lore to the faction, and they've got quite a tragic backstory. But one of the best bits about them is everyone else worships their gods, right? The Imperium worships the God Emperor, the Orks worship Gork and Mork, the Chaos Space Marines worship the Chaos Gods. The Necron gods were too much trouble to be worth dealing with, so they killed them all and then enslaved the rest of them. On the tabletop, they are defined by their reanimation protocol mechanic. This means that any unit at the beginning of a turn, which is not at its full strength, whether it's lost some wounds or if it's lost some models, can regrow up to D3 models or D3 wounds. This means that if you don't wipe a Necron unit out, they are going to start regrowing, and they can get a lot of free models over the course of the game if you don't concentrate your fire. In many ways, Necrons, I see them as the Marine equivalent in the Xenos camp, because they're pretty durable. They have got some decent maneuverability with lots of teleportation. They've got a mixture of elite units, a mixture of line infantry. Necrons can do a bit of everything. Where they are defined, what separates them is they tend to be quite reliant on their characters, a little bit like the Guard. A Necron unit not being led by a Cryptek is going to struggle. And also, their biggest disadvantage is if they get wiped out. So if a Necron unit gets completely battered, just blown off the table, which is very doable in 40k, it's a very lethal game, then you're essentially paying for that reanimation protocol, but you don't get the advantage of leveraging it. It's a little bit like the Genestealer Cult problem. It's not as extreme with the GSC problem, because I don't feel like Necrons pay for reanimation protocol as much as GSC clearly pay for maybe getting whole units back, but it's definitely a disadvantage because it means that your opponent, through clever play, can essentially negate your main army rule. So up until this point, a lot of the factions we've looked at take themselves fairly seriously. The next faction absolutely doesn't. These are the happy-go-lucky comedic faction of the setting. They are the Orks. Essentially, giant green mushroom men who are also football hooligans, and they are a ton of fun. You'll never come across a salty or sad Ork player because they get their faction. They understood the assignment when they started collecting the Space Orks. On the tabletop, trying to define an Orky playstyle is hard because they're a faction that's been around a long time. They've got a very, very deep unit roster, and they can kind of do any playstyle that you want. But traditionally, Orks are seen as a melee faction, and they're also traditionally seen as more of a horde faction. The quintessential Ork playstyle, something they've been able to do since they were introduced to the game, is something called the Green Tide. This is where you take as many of your basic Ork boys as possible, put them on the board, and bum rush the enemy down. If you make it, you'll have a good scrap. If you don't make it, you'll still have a ton of fun moving your big blobs of Orks around the board. But I can't stress this enough. That is one of a myriad of Ork playstyles. Saying that Green Tide is the only thing they do would be dishonest and be a disservice to the faction. You can have Mad Max style buggy armies, people driving around in ramshackle vehicles. You can have armies of elite power armored mega knobs, and I know what that sounds like. And then you can have regular knobs back in the... I know what that sounds like as well. You can go elite. You can go wide, you can go tall, you can go mechanized, you can go pure infantry. There's even a playstyle called the War AF. That's where you take all aircraft. Where you take all the fighter bombers and the burner bombers, and you take the Dakar jets. They can do anything. But they do tend to do better at melee than they do at shooting. If an Ork army, even if it specializes absolutely into it, wants to get into a firefight with an Imperial Guard army, more often than not, they are going to lose that firefight. But in my mind, the best thing about the Orks has nothing to do with the tabletop. It's to do with the real life aspects. Firstly, the community is amazing. You'll never find a bad Ork player. They are always really welcoming, they're always really fun, they're always really laid back, and they just go with the flow when you are playing a game or talking to them about 40k. You'll never find an Ork player that is going to get salty when one of his units doesn't perform. He will cheer at the epic highs and the terrible lows on both sides of the table. But then you've got the looting. It is well established both in real life and on the tabletop that the Orks love to loot enemy vehicles. There used to be rules where they could loot things like Leman Russes and Predators. They don't really have that anymore, but you can still take a Space Marine Rhino and Orkify the crap out of it and use it as an Ork truck. You can still take a Rogel Dawn or something similar, or Land Raider, and use that to represent a battle wagon. You can have Kitbash Sentinels to represent the Killer Cans and Death Dreads. Orks are the faction that you basically have to get if the best thing that you like doing is building models and coming up with crazy contraptions and designs. The best Ork kitbash I've ever seen is when someone took an R2-D2 model, a giant like remote control R2-D2, and turned it into a stomper. But if the Ork technology is crude and cobbled together and built from scrap, our next faction is the total opposite. We have got the Tau Empire. The Tau Empire is defined by their enlightenment and their belief in technology. Whereas everyone else is superstitious and brutal, the Tau are often seen as a force for good within the 40k setting. Sometimes people don't like this because it feels like they're a little bit out of place, but sometimes it's quite interesting to see the horrific nature of the 40k universe through the eyes of a faction that is essentially new to the setting. Not from the tabletop, they've been around since 3rd edition, but from a lore perspective. Sometimes Tau is often seen as a bit of a naive faction, but no one can deny that they are going into this galaxy with the right tools. The Tau are a shooting faction. They believe in ranged combat, and they see melee combat as uncivilized. Now on the tabletop, this leads to them being one of, if not the best shooting army in the game. In fact, whilst a lot of Guard players won't like me saying this, Guard versus Tau, often Guard come out the worst in that firefight, and there's almost no other faction that can do that to us. In terms of their playstyle, you should see them as faster, punchier Imperial Guard. Imperial Guard tends to be quite a lumbering beast, a behemoth of an army, brutally fighting across the board in attrition warfare. Tau is kind of like Eldar and Dark Eldar. They're going to hit you from angles you probably didn't expect. They've got a lot of flying vehicles, they've got a lot of deep striking, they've got big battle suits like the Riptides, they've got infiltrators like the Stealth Suit and the Ghost Kill. But however you look at it, they're not trying to get into combat with you. They are trying to shoot you up. Even if it's at point blank range, they're trying to shoot you up. In 10th edition, Games Workshop has made a big effort to try and diversify the Tau playstyle by doing a big range refresh with the Kroot, because unlike other factions, Tau actually work with other alien races, and it's more of a kind of like the Federation, kind of like the Covenant. You know, it's an allied empire of many different races with the Tau sort of sat on the top. But even with the efforts from GW, I would say that in 10th edition, they're still a shooty-focused army, and things like Kroot tend to get used as chaff and screens to slow down the enemy melee stuff, so the Tau have got more time to shoot at them. This specialization and focus on firepower is both their greatest advantage and disadvantage. The advantage being, of course, that no one can outshoot them. The disadvantage being if people do get up close and personal, even factions which don't normally specialize in melee, they're going to get their shit pushed in. Like Guardsmen, who are not a melee faction, will beat Tau in combat without much help. Unfortunately, the biggest problem with this shooting focus has led to Tau having a frankly dire reputation in the hobby. It is not uncommon for people to unironically hate playing against Tau, because it often feels like over edition after edition that the Tau just blow you off the board in a couple of turns. You couldn't really do anything about it. Because they're quite fast, they get to sneak around the ruins, they get to draw the angles to you, and then shoot you off the board. I would say this reputation is now changing. GW with 10th edition has done a lot of work on making Tau feel a lot less unpleasant to play into. They're still lethal, they're still brutally efficient, and you can still have games where you feel kind of bad playing with them or feel bad playing into them. But what Games Workshop has done is they've altered the balance. Tau used to be quite an elite army. You'd have things like 3 Riptides be the majority of someone's army list, or they'd have just like a couple of giant blobs of battle suits. And because these forces were so good at force concentration, it meant that nothing could really go toe-to-toe with them, and they could just drop down and clear everything. I mean, back in 5th and 6th edition, there was something called Farsight Bomb, where literally you could put like 1,000 points of your army into one unit, deep strike it down, and you could table people in one shooting phase with this one unit. Now, obviously, that's an older edition, and we're talking about 10th edition. In 10th edition, GW has watered down the individual power of a lot of Tau units. And now, as crazy as it sounds, it seems like what they've really done is they've tried to make Tau feel like Xenos Guard. Whenever I used to play Guard into Tau, it was like I just outnumbered them. They were quality and I was quantity. Now when I play into Tau, they can bring as much stuff to the table as I can. And this means that it often doesn't feel like they just completely dunk on you, and it makes it a lot less frustrating to play against them. Because, unlike before where they blow off the table and even if you got close to them, they just have like a million shield drones and you can never actually get the thing you wanted to kill, now you will do damage to them. They're going to hurt you, but you will be inflicting casualties on them. And so it doesn't feel like the game is completely meaningless. They've got a long way to go. and they still have a few problems with being bad and having some feel badsies, but they're a lot better than they used to be. And personally, as someone who used to really dislike playing into Tau, so much so that I made an hour-long rant video in the early days of my YouTube career about how much I dislike playing them, even I now don't have any problems playing into them and have had many fun games playing into the Tau. Their reputation is on the mend, but if you collect them, don't be surprised if you have a few grognards that still give you a bit of shit for playing them. And last, but certainly not least, we have the Tyranids. Probably the most alien faction in 40k. They are the classic aliens. They are space bugs. They are a swarm of locusts that descend on planets and eat them. Tyranids are a really cool army. They are, unlike everyone else, purely organic. Whereas you've got a lot of factions that are mostly organic, but still use like technology, Tyranids are purely organic. And the whole thing is they can evolve and they can create new bioforms. Tyranids are a hive mind. It's like a swarm of insects descending upon you. Some people see the army as having not a lot of personality. I mean, at the end of the day, there are no individuals in the swarm. There are a couple of named characters like Old One Eye or the Swarm Lord, but generally you are collecting not the protagonist, but you are collecting the antagonist. You are collecting the endless, faceless hordes of henchmen that other people get to mow down. I mean, look at Space Marine 2. That's a game where you start off just mowing down loads of Tyranids, and the main bad guy in that isn't even the Tyranids. It's later on when the Chaos Forces turn up. And that makes sense, because if the whole game was just playing Tyranids, there wouldn't be much story, there wouldn't be much intrigue. So Tyranids are sometimes seen as a little bit faceless, lacking personality. But as someone who has a really large Tyranid swarm, I used to think that, and after playing with them, I really enjoy it. There's something very cathartic about just playing the endless swarm, the aliens, the unknown menace. Something about playing the Zerg, the Arachnids, and Starship Troopers. You are not the main character, but you still are an important part of the story of what's happening on the battlefield. And whilst it can be really fun being on the other side of the table against Tyranids, trying to hold off the endless swarm, there is a real joy in commanding the swarm and being on the other side of the glorious last stand at Whiskey Outpost. On the tabletop, in terms of their gameplay, Tyranids traditionally are seen as a swarm faction. You're going to take lots and lots of little bugs that try and overwhelm the enemy with numbers. But truthfully, that's never been their most effective playstyle. Tyranids do well when they bring lots of different things together, when they have swarms of bugs to absorb all the bullets, to absorb the initial casualties, and then they have big bugs that can take a lot of damage, that can move up in amongst the swarm. Really, Tyranids are at their best when you're leveraging a bit of a hybrid force rather than skewing in one direction. But in terms of their skew playstyle, the one that over all the editions has been probably the most effective, even if it's been on and off effective, has been what's called Nidzilla. This is where you just take big stuff. It's like taking an Imperial Guard tank company, but it's always been a bit more effective than that. And this is because, unlike tanks which don't like getting tied up in melee, most Tyranid monsters can shoot stuff, and they're perfectly happy to stab you in the face with a big scything talon if you get close to them or if they get close to you. But kind of like Imperial Guard and kind of like Chaos Space Marines, the big thing with Tyranids is there's almost any playstyle that you want. You want to go full swarm, you can do. You want to go hybrid, you can do. You want to have an army of all infiltrators, you can do. You want to have an army of all flying buggers, you can do. You want to be fast, you want to be slow, you want to be big, you want to be small. All the different playstyles can be accommodated. And in many ways, that old adage for the guard army's never finished, absolutely applies to the Tyranids, and all of the advantages of that and all the disadvantages that we've covered previously really apply to them. But as someone who's a recent convert to the hive mind, I have to say they're a ton of fun to play. And if there was one thing that distinguishes them from maybe Horde armies like Guard, is that whereas Guard often feels like more of a defensive faction, the enemy's coming to you and you're trying to like shoot them down, Tyranids feel like a very aggressive faction. you are going to be on the attack. You are going to be doing the attacking, and the enemy, you're going to be proactive, and the enemy is going to be reactive to you. So they're a much more aggressive army than might first meet the eye, and I think that's because they do have a tendency to be a bit more melee focused. But unlike armies like Orks, which are really melee focused, or World Eaters, which are absolutely melee focused, I would say Nids are a little bit more like 60-40. 60% of the time, they're going to eat you. And 40% of the time, they're going to shoot a bug from a long distance away that then's going to eat you. But that just about covers it. All of the Warhammer 40k factions, their pros and cons, and what they feel like to play on the tabletop. But of course, all of this is just like my opinion, man. Let me know what you think down in the comment section below. Do you have a favorite faction? Let me know if there's something that maybe I missed about that and that you think is a good point. And are you interested in getting into 40k? And which faction have you got your eye on? If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe. It really does boost the video with the YouTube algorithm. Would you like to know more? If so, then please consider becoming a channel member or patron. By supporting the channel, not only will you be doing your part, but you'll also be helping me create more content for your viewing pleasure and unlocking a whole host of perks. You get everything from a badge next to your name, custom emojis, but the big one is access to the Mordian Glory Discord server, an online community with almost 2,500 active members. It's always popping off in the MG Discord. We've got channels for army lists, hobbying, tactics, stories, and even a pretty spicy meme section as well. For all you greenhorns that wanted to see the Mordian glory hole, today is your lucky day. And joking aside, I do want to say a massive thank you to all of the current channel members and patrons. You guys are amazing, truly the lifeblood of the channel. I could not do Mordian Glory full time without the incredible and generous support of my members, so thank you guys so much. And last but certainly not least, I want to say a personal thank you to all of my top tier Patreons. These are the War Masters, the people who have truly gone above and beyond the call of duty. So a heartfelt thank you to Alex Dengal, Bonbon Vert, Lord Pryor, Mark Panconi, RJ Scorpion, Swordfish Trombone, Try Again Bragg, John Stubbs, Nick Walsh, Diesel Fox, and August Barney. Seriously guys, thank you from the bottom of my heart. Your support is incredible and it makes a huge difference. Thank you so much. That's all for now. Hope you've all enjoyed today's video, and of course, as always, see you guys next time.